In the year 70 AD, the dust of the road chokes the air as a spectacle of absolute power marches toward the heart of the eternal city, a procession that history books have long sanitized but whose reality remains etched in the blood-soaked soil of antiquity. Imagine yourself standing there on the edge of that Via Sacra, the heat of the Mediterranean sun beating down, as the rhythmic, metallic thunder of the legions announces a return of Rome's conquerors. Banners of crimson silk snap violently in the wind, and polished armor fractures the daylight into blinding shards of glory. Yet amidst this flawlessly choreographed display of martial supremacy, dragged behind the chariots and the soldiers, stumbling in iron chains, are hundreds of women with eyes void of hope, women who have already realized that the release of death would have been a kindness compared to the living nightmare that is about to begin. This is not the sanitized narrative of heroic conquest or the spreading of civilization, but rather a forensic accounting of what actually occurred when the Roman eagle dug its talons into a defeated city, a chronicle of the fate reserved for female prisoners of war, and an examination of practices that transmuted military triumph into something far more sinister than mere territorial expansion. What unfolds in this narrative is not a work of dark fiction or modern reinterpretation, but a reality preserved in the cold ink of generals' dispatches, in the fragments of ancient historians, and in legal proceedings that have miraculously survived nearly 2,000 years of decay. And yet, this is a history that has been meticulously excised from school curricula and absent from the grand cinematic portrayals of the empire, because there are some truths so unsettling, so contradictory to the myth of Western civilization, that society prefers they remain buried. Before we descend further into this deliberately forgotten abyss, if you believe that history should be confronted in its rawest, most unvarnished form, please support this channel's mission to uncover the past as it truly was by subscribing and leaving alike a small digital gesture that empowers us to keep illuminating the stories that power has worked so tirelessly to erase. We are raised on the legends of Rome's glory, legions that brought order to the known world, of victorious generals parading through cheering crowds while displaying prisoners as living proof of imperial dominance. The official, palatable story is straightforward and clinical. Captive became slaves, sent to labor in mines, to work the soil of vast estates, or to serve in the households of the wealthy patricians. A brutal destiny, certainly, but one framed as the standard, inevitable consequence of ancient warfare. This is a version that endures because it is clean, it is orderly, and it fits the narrative of structure, but the surviving documents whisper a different, far more harrowing tale. According to a military report preserved within the archives of the British Museum, dating back to the reign of Emperor Trajan following the brutal conquest of Dacia in 106 AD, approximately 15,000 women were seized as captives, yet the official record speaks only of their distribution among the legions and their subsequent transfer to provinces. Distribution is such a sterile, administrative word, a term of logistics and bureaucracy that remains bloodless until one reads the personal accounts, the letters scrawled of families back home, the private diaries unearthed in the ruin of abandoned forts, and the notes never intended for the eyes of history. It is only then that the word distribution begins to shed its mask and reveal its true meaning, because what befell these women before they ever reached the status of domestic servants was a ritual of systematic humiliation, a celebration of victory carved directly into the bodies of the defeated, and a political act of terror masquerading as battlefield brutality. One must ask, can it even be classified as mere brutality when it was calculated, organized, and tacitly approved by the Roman state itself? When the city walls were breached and the defenses crumbled, there was a sequence of events, not a frenzy of chaos, but a procedure of cold efficiency. First, the men of fighting age were segregated, with some executed summarily to quell resistance, while others were shackled for the entertainment of the arena, and the children and elderly were deemed burdensome, often abandoned or eliminated depending on the logistical constraints of the moment. Then came the women, specifically the young women who formed a third, distinct category, treated with a terrifying specificity. They were herded into the central square of the smoking, conquered city, stripped of their garments and exposed beneath the harsh sun and the leering gaze of the entire legion, kept there for hours or even days while officers conducted a process of deselection. The most physically striking were marked, sometimes with red dye applied to the left shoulder, and set aside for the high command, while the remainder were allocated to the rank-and-file soldiers in a process that even had a formal Latin designation, praeta bellica feminarum, or female war spoils. This term appears in military manuals and official correspondence, confirming that taxes were indeed levied on this human property, just as they would be on livestock or grain. A fragment of a letter discovered in the ruins of Pompeii, written by a legionary named Marcus Flavius during the grim campaigns in Germania, describes a scene with detachment that chills the blood even centuries later, as he wrote, "I took 3 for myself on the first night. The youngest cried without stopping. The second tried to bite, but the third simply stared at nothing as if she were already gone. So I preferred the third because she was easier." That single word, easier, echoes across the abyss of centuries because it exposes the fundamental nature of this violence, revealing that it was not driven solely by lust or the release of tension, but by domination, by the need to erase dignity before erasing identity, and about converting human beings into hollow objects before formally enslaving them. The Roman generals understood the political utility of this ritual with absolute, icy clarity, viewing it not as a perk for soldiers weary from long campaigns, but as a demonstration of total power, a message delivered without ambiguity to any population that dare consider resistance. This is the fate of your daughters, your sisters, your wives. This message was brutally effective, as evidenced by the Roman historian Tacitus, who chronicled the great revolt led by Queen Boudica in Britain in 60 AD. He records that after her capture, Boudica herself was flogged and her daughters were publicly violated by Roman officers, not merely as a personal punishment, but as a calculated example meant to establish the absolute supremacy of imperial authority. The warrior queen who had the audacity to defy Rome was reduced to a spectacle of helplessness. Her daughters, princesses by royal birth, transformed into instruments of instruction for a watching populace. When Boudica later rallied her forces for a final, desperate stand, she was not fighting merely for territory or sovereignty, but for something far older and more visceral, for revenge that could never truly be sated, for a dignity that could never be fully restored, and for the screams that had been forced into silence. She was ultimately defeated, and what became of the women of her tribe after final suppression was never fully recorded by the victors. But we know this. Britannia did not rebel again for 3 centuries. Is such silence always evidence of peace, or is it sometimes a result of a terror so complete that even the capacity for speech is stolen away? Yet, this battlefield violation was only the beginning, for after the first days of chaos, after the ritual domination, came the bureaucratic phase, the industrial conversion of people into property. The survivors were branded, quite literally, with hot irons pressed into their flesh, burning symbols that identified the specific legion that had captured them in the campaign in which they were taken, marks of ownership carved into the skin, often on the face, ensuring their condition could never be concealed or forgotten. Then came the transport, chained together in coffles of 10 or 20, forced to march hundreds of kilometers toward the coastal ports, where they waited in dark, damp warehouses, the very same structures used to store grain and olive oil, treated as just another commodity awaiting shipment. A commercial inventory preserved in the sands of Alexandria, dated to 115 AD, records a mixed cargo of a merchant vessel in chilling detail. 340 amphorae of wine, 120 barrels of wheat, 89 women from Judea, and 14 Berber horses. They're on the same ledger, in the same accounting category, possessing the same logistical value as wine and livestock, were women listed as freight. The sea crossing that followed lasted weeks, during which they were kept below deck, chained in rows with barely enough space to sit upright and no room to lie flat, with daily rations calculated precisely to keep them on the edge of survival and nothing more. Many died during the journey from disease, dehydration, or simply the sheer will surrender life, and their bodies were cast into the sea without ritual or record. There exists a grim economic calculation preserved in a Roman treatise on estate management written in the 1st century by Columella, who estimated that an acceptable loss rate during the transport of female war captives was between 20 and 30%, using the word acceptable as though he were discussing the spoilage of fruit or the breakage of pottery. When they finally arrived in Rome or the other major metropolises of the empire, the next stage of their descent began: the auctions. These were specialized markets where wealthy buyers inspected human merchandise with the same clinical detachment one would use to inspect livestock, hands probing flesh, teeth examined, mouths forced open, and signs of illness, injury, or pregnancy carefully checked. The youngest and most physically desirable commanded enormous prices purchased by patricians for their households, by elite brothels, or by temples that offered specialized services to devotees of certain Eastern cults. The rest, the women whose appearance had deteriorated during the grueling journey, those marked by too many scars, those who had resisted too fiercely, or those who had broken mentally, were sold in bulk to mines, farms, and workshops where life expectancy rarely exceeded 5 years. However, there was a fate considered by many to be worse than the mines. The brothels, specialized establishments that operated openly in every Roman city, legal, regulated, and taxed, where the Roman state profited from every single transaction. Female prisoners of war were the most sought-after commodity in these places, and one must ask why. It was because they were foreign, because they came from defeated peoples, and because violating the daughter and enemy offered ordinary Roman citizens a vicarious sense of participation in imperial conquest. A man who had never carried a shield or drawn a sword could, for a few coins, feel like a victor, a conqueror by proxy. A piece of graffiti found in Pompeii, scratched onto the wall of a brothel, reads simply, "Here I penetrated a Britain," a statement implying that Rome was eternal and that even the most intimate act was transformed into a political decoration. The women in these places had no names, identified only by their origin, the Gaul, the German, the Jew, and they worked in cubicles smaller than 2 square meters. Windowless cells with a single curtain as a door, servicing between 10 and 20 men per day. There was no retirement, no release, no exit. Many turned to suicide, while others lost their sanity completely, and a very small number survived long enough to be freed. But even freedom did not erase what had been done, for brand on the face and the memory in the body remained. In the 2nd century, a Roman physician named Serenus of Ephesus wrote a treatise on gynecology in which one chapter addressed illnesses common among women used in war prostitution, describing chronic inflammation, premature infertility, and recurring hemorrhages before adding, almost as a passing remark, that brothel owners are advised to renew their stock every 3 or 4 years, as after this period the merchandise loses commercial value and productive capacity. Renew the stock, he wrote, as one might replace broken jars. All of this entire industrial system of dehumanization, functioned openly, with nothing hidden, nothing denied, and no shame attached to it. It was simply considered the natural order of things, the logical outcome of military victory, where the defeated paid with everything they were and everything they might have become. The question lingers hauntingly. How much of this calculated coldness still survives in modern wars, merely under different names? Behind that wall of historical silence lies something even darker, which is the near total absence of first-person accounts. For the victims themselves left no written testimony, could not write the language of their conquerors, had no access to materials, and even if they had, who would have recorded their words? Yet there are rare, disturbing exceptions. In the 2nd century, a woman named Blandina appears in early Christian writings, originally a slave captured during a campaign in Gaul. She converted to Christianity while serving in a Roman household. When her faith was discovered and she was arrested, she spoke during interrogation about her past, and one surviving fragment records her chilling words. "They asked if I feared death, and I told them I had already died many times. They killed me the night my village burned. They killed me on the march to the sea. They killed me in the ship's hold, and they killed me the first time a Roman man called me property." For Blandina, death before the lions would only confirm what was already true. She was executed in the arena, but her words endured because they revealed something essential. The trauma was not only physical but existential, a destruction not merely of the body but of the very idea of being human. These women were forced to learn a terrible truth, that dignity, identity, and human worth are not fixed attributes but conventions, revocable in an instant when force disappears. As long as Rome prevailed, that convention stood for the victors, but when Rome conquered, it ended for the vanquished, and once broken, it could never be rebuilt. Even when freed, even when escaped, even decades later, the fracture remained because the revelation could not be unlearned. You are human only as long as someone stronger allows you to be. Another document from the 2nd century recorded a rebellion of enslaved women in a rural settlement in Spain, where they killed the owner and his family in the middle of the night. When they were captured, the leader, a Germanic woman identified in the records only as the red-haired one, was brought before a judge prior to execution and spoke only once, saying, You taught us that the world belongs to the violent. We only practiced the lesson. She was crucified alongside 17 others, but the sentence endured because it exposed the central hypocrisy of the entire system. Rome saw itself as civilization, believing it brought order, law, and structure to a barbaric world, replacing chaos with discipline and elevating humanity through conquest. But that civilization was constructed on systematic violence, on the calculated exploitation of the bodies and inner lives of the defeated. When the defeated turned that same logic of violence back upon Rome, they were no longer considered participants in the natural order, but criminals. A Roman historian writing centuries later recorded a moment that quietly revealed this contradiction. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 5th century, described events during the invasions of the Huns, incursions that would ultimately help fracture the Roman Empire itself, and noted something unsettling. Some Roman women taken captive during these invasions appeared strangely resigned to their fate, not hysterical, not defiant, but resigned, as if they recognized in what was happening to them a distant echo of something their own ancestors had once inflicted upon others, history folding inward on itself, Rome harvesting what it had sown over centuries of conquest. But this recognition redeemed no one. It did not spare those Roman women from suffering, nor did it lessen the horror awaiting them. It merely revealed a nauseating truth, that human beings possess an almost limitless capacity to turn the pain of others into system, into tradition, into routine, into something that feels normal. When one system collapses, another is already waiting beneath it, and while the machinery changes hands, the logic remains. So the question emerges, have we truly evolved, or have we merely changed the clothing of the same cruelty? History books rarely dedicate more than a paragraph to the fate of prisoners of war in antiquity, and when women are mentioned at all, the language becomes deliberately vague, using terms like enslaved and exploited, but this careful silence exists for a reason. As the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg once observed, the boundary between the sacred and the profane is thin and almost always drawn by power. Rome became the civilizational template for the Western world, its legal framework shaping modern systems of law, its military organization informing contemporary armies, and its architecture still copied in capitals across the globe. To fully confront the systematic nature of Roman sexual violence would require questioning the foundations of this admiration. It would require acknowledging that civilization carries a cost, and that this cost is almost always paid by the most vulnerable. So instead, we choose elegance, we choose silence. We focus on aqueducts, on roads, on laws. We celebrate Julius Caesar as a brilliant military mind, while forgetting that his campaigns in Gaul resulted in the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of women and children. We watch films in which gladiators fight heroically for freedom, yet we never see what existed just beyond the arena walls. Never see the brothels beside the Colosseum. Never see the lines of men waiting their turn with newly arrived captives, because that would be uncomfortable, and discomfort is precisely what history demands. There is a tombstone in a museum in London, dated to the 2nd century and found near what was once a Roman fort in Britain, bearing a brief inscription. Here once was a woman, her name forgotten, her homeland forgotten. May the gods show her more mercy than Rome did. No name, no story, only an anonymous acknowledgement of suffering too heavy to describe. How many others were there? Millions. Across 6 centuries of imperial expansion, countless women passed through the same cycle, born free, captured, violated, enslaved, erased. Their lives were reduced to figures in military reports, numbers in commercial inventories, footnotes in history books most people never open, but every statistic was a complete human life. A girl with a name, with parents, with hopes, a woman who loved and was loved, a full human being reduced to an object by men who believed victory granted them that right. This was not a single night of uncontrolled rage. It was methodical, repeated, normalized. It was not a failure of civilization. It was civilization functioning exactly as designed. As one anthropologist would later argue, war is not the breakdown of order. It is its foundation. Every state is born from the ability to organize violence on an industrial scale, and Rome proves the argument because these horrors were not produced by chaos. They were produced by perfect order. The machine operated smoothly. Soldiers did their duty. Merchants conducted business. Citizens frequented licensed establishments and paid their taxes, and everything was legal. Everything was justified. Everything was considered natural. How many modern systems speak in the same language? How many present-day cruelties are defended by necessity, by security, by order? The weeping of millions of women whose names were never carved into stone still lingers beneath the ruins. They built Rome as much as its engineers and generals did. Built it with their bodies, with their lives, with everything they were and everything they might have been. A poet once wrote that the people of the past were no worse than us. They simply did not know what we would later discover. But did they truly not know, or did they know perfectly well and simply choose not to care? The records existed. The documents survived. Anyone who wanted to know could know, for the Romans themselves documented everything with meticulous bureaucracy. The issue was never ignorance. It was complicity. And when we choose today to celebrate Rome's greatness without acknowledging its foundations of suffering, when we teach young people about the glory of the legions without explaining what followed victory, when we watch stories of emperors and gladiators and conveniently forget the rest, do we not become complicit as well? Do we not continue the silence that began 2,000 years ago? The truth is uncomfortable, and we prefer comforting myths to disturbing realities, prefer simple heroes to the recognition that almost all human greatness is purchased at an obscene price. We prefer to believe that those times were different, that we have progressed, that we would never do the same. But we do, in different forms, under different justifications, in different places. Sexual exploitation in war zones did not end with Rome. The conversion of human beings into marketable objects did not end with Rome. And systematic violence against the defeated, the displaced, the refugee did not end with Rome. It only changed its language. As long as we look to the past only to admire its achievements while refusing to confront its horrors, as long as we learn from history only the lessons that allow us to feel good about ourselves, not as a warning we heed, but as a prophecy we insist on fulfilling, we are doomed to repeat it. So ask yourself, have these horrors truly remained in the past? Or have we simply learned to hide them better, to justify them with more sophisticated words, to embed them in systems so complex that we no longer have to look directly at what we do? Is the difference between us and the Romans moral or merely technological? And when you close your eyes at night, when the world grows quiet and only your conscience remains, can you hear the echo, or have you learned, like generations before you, to turn screams into whispers so faint they sound like part of the wind? Power in every era finds a way to sanctify its own sin. So the final question is simple. Will you continue kneeling at that altar?